From Minnesota, Rod Graham. Senator Graham, welcome to Face to Face.
Jason, my pleasure to be here.
Senator,
Vance, great to see you.
The campaign, I'm certain Vance is going to remind you, is a very tough one. This election cycle, there are a number of polls out. You appear to be behind in some of these polls. How do you assess the way things are going, and what do you need to do to be reelected?
Well, we knew it was going to be an uphill battle because whoever our Democratic opponent was going to be, we knew he had very deep pockets and was going to be able to spend a lot more money, and that's the way this has turned out. Here's a guy who's bent on buying an election seat and hasn't really been able to come up with any definite plans on what he is offering. He's got some ideas and some concepts, but even the Star Tribune called him the most radical of all the Democrats who were running in this race. And his ideas and his plans, whether it's dealing with Social Security, whether it's dealing with health care, whether it's dealing with prescription drugs, or even his attempt to look at the farm crisis, are very radical ideas. But it's hard for Minnesotans to understand them because Mark Dayton will not come out and talk about them or give any details to what he's doing.
You know, Senator, I think Minnesotans are smart enough not to allow someone to buy an election. You've had
$20 million is going to answer that question on November 7th.
Well, I think it's really the issues, and you've had 6 years to explain your positions. I'd like to talk about some of the issues. Later on, I will bring up some of the style of some of the ads that have been used. Let me start off with HMOs. Do you favor a patient's Bill of Rights that would allow patients to sue his or her HMO?
Yes.
Well, 37 states allow it. Minnesota does not. The Republican bill, which I assume is the one you support,
That's right.
puts severe restrictions on what kinds of reasonable medical necessity and whether or not there's an ability of people to sue. The Democratic version does not. Why?
It doesn't put the restrictions on it. It just goes at it a different way. Under the Democratic plan, they say they don't want an accountant or the insurance person in with the doctor and the patient.
And with the doctor make that
Well,
decision.
no, they want to take the insurance man out, but they want to put an attorney in his place. So
If
in other
they
words,
deny coverage.
they want to open the door wide open first shot and then let it sue. Our plan says let's use mediation and arbitration to settle if there are disputes or differences of opinion between the patient, between the insurance, or what the doctor has to say. The insurance then has to abide, if not by the doctor's decision, by an outside independent opinion. Then, if it's not going to give coverage, then you can take them to court. So in other words, let's try to get health care first. If that's denied or a disagreement, then let's take them to court. Right away.
Vance's approach is let's take them to court first, and then we'll worry about health care.
No, I think I'd let the electorate make the decision whether or not they have been happy about HMOs.
Well, under the Democratic plan, could you sue the employer, not just the HMO,
That's right.
but the employer, because they don't provide you with the health care benefits an attorney deems is appropriate?
This is the biggest differences between our bills are very similar now as far as being able to sue insurance or your HMO. And we think that's proper and we need to do. If you're making decisions regarding the health care, you should be responsible for the decisions. But what they want to do, and I say they, the Democrats, Ted Kennedy leading the charge, Mark Dayton right behind them supporting this bill, would allow the employer also be sued. So in other words, the person who is going to purchase the insurance, and by the way, no law says you have to do this. This is voluntary.
Well, we'll get to that in a minute.
So the employer buys the insurance. Now they're going to become liable for this. And I've talked to some of the biggest employers in Minnesota who said that if the Kennedy plan would pass, they would immediately drop health care because they're not going to be held liable. And not only the large insurers, talk about some of the small employers who are able to provide health care. They could not extend the exposure to $5 million in lawsuits because some attorney wants to have some additional dollars this year.
Well, you know, Senator, I guess we'll have to let the electorate determine whether or not they're so happy with HMOs they shouldn't have redress to the attorneys of their choice.
Well,
let me ask you a question about...
I think they should have that opportunity to go after the HMOs if they want. So it's not, I'm not here trying to hide or protect HMOs. What I'm here trying to do is to make sure that the patient gets the care they need when they need it as soon as possible, and that more of the benefits go to health care rather than to lawyers.
Let me
I
ask
know you're an attorney, Vance.
Well, I have been an attorney. I plead
You don't really think, though, the employer should be sued over any sort of benefit plan, be it health or anything else, do you?
Well, I think that it depends on what is promised and what is delivered. And
well, that's a contractual dispute, and you can sue under that right now.
Well, you cannot. There are restrictions under ERISA, but in terms of other benefits. But let me get back to the senator. Senator, on the question of prescription drugs, do you think there ought to be a one world price for prescription drugs?
Oh, that's impossible. I mean, otherwise that means you're going to have price controls, and this is again what Mark Dayton would like. He's said in his reports, in fact, that
what about Gil Goodnick? Isn't that?
Well, Mark Dayton said he would want the government to sit down with the pharmaceutical companies and negotiate out the profits. So in other words, he wants the government to set price controls. The government would become the purchaser and the distributor of pharmaceuticals. Now, there is a market out there, and it works. And the fair market gives people the best choice, and that's important, choice, the best product, which is important, at the best price. Price controls, you know, they tried that out of Moscow for 70 years.
Yeah, well, I haven't
It
heard
didn't
anyone
work.
suggest price control, Senator.
Well, Mark Dayton did.
Well, and Mark isn't here to rebut that. I guess my concern about prescription drugs for seniors is that there is, I think, a rather developing consensus that seniors are being required to pay too much, in many cases more in this country than the same drugs outside the country. And we haven't heard you, as United States Senator, until this issue became hot politically and raised by Mark Dayton, we haven't heard you on this subject for 5.5 years.
Well, and again, that's not true, because over 2 years ago, I started working on this plan when it wasn't a big political issue. Over a year ago, I introduced a plan called MEDS into the Congress, into the United States Senate. MEDS, Medicare Insuring Prescriptions for Seniors. And it's a plan that would help the neediest in our society. Those who have to choose between meals and medicine would get help. And by the way, under our plan, they would get it today if the bill was signed law by the President, not phased in as Mark Dayton and others would do.
No, that's the Clinton bill, not the Dayton plan.
Well, Dayton hasn't given any definition to his, so all we can do.
Let's talk about
it's not fair, Vance, that I have been, and I've been working on this more than 2 years, and introduced a bill more than a year ago. So to say that I haven't been out there working and concerned about it, I'm not the one that made it a campaign issue. Mark Dayton, when he starts driving buses to Canada and running ads that focus groups told him to run, selling off his health care policy or stocks just to try cleanse himself.
Almost buying votes.
So he could call them drug lords. To me, he is the one who's made politics.
Senator, you're not going to attack somebody for having stocks
Oh, no, I never
when you
did.
take money from pharmaceutical companies.
I never attacked him because he owns stocks. And by the way, 77% of my financing of my campaign has come from 47,000 individuals.
And how much from
Not
pharmaceutical
one
companies?
with a-
Let's talk about
I don't
Medicare.
either.
Let's talk about Medicare, because in 1995, Democrat John Breaux of Louisiana was asked to form this Medicare commission at the behest of President Clinton, and they came back with the Breaux Commission report, which would provide prescription drugs for the needy.
That's correct.
You supported that.
I did.
Bipartisan Democrats and Republicans support it. Who killed that?
It was President Clinton who pulled the plug on this, and I did support it. In fact, I do support it now because he's
That was
introduced
5 years ago, not 1 year ago, not 2 years ago. It was 5 years ago.
Always makes me feel good to see Jason supporting a conservative Democrat.
Well, so I'm
It's
just
a good
pointing
effort.
out that Senator Graham's and Republicans were in favor of prescription drugs going back to the Breaux Commission 5 years ago. What they're not in favor of are working class Minnesotans paying for Mark Dayton's drugs. And that is
You said
different.
that on your radio program.
And that's what he would do. He would basically, because he wants a one world order here where the government handles everything. And that would take choice away from people. And if you think that the government is going to provide every prescription that they need at every cost that they can afford and give them the choice, that's ridiculous. Look at Medicare and some of the other programs. The government cannot do it as well as
One
the
more point
private
on
sector.
Medicare, and I think this is an
We're
area
gonna
where all
we're gonna
three of
take a
us
break.
could agree on patents, and I want to come back to that.
All right, I understand. I think that is a good issue, and that raises actually the Gutnick bill too.
Right.
Senator, when we come back, we all discuss that issue a little more, the patent issue, the international aspect of drug patents. The other issue that I frankly want to get to is the style of your campaign, the style of your ads, some of which we find somewhat objectionable. I want to explore that with you and give you a chance to respond. We'll be discussing those issues with Senator Graham as he seeks your votes for re-election right here. I'm Vance Opperman, co-host with Jason Lewis on Face to Face. We're discussing the senatorial race here in Minnesota. We have Senator Graham's the incumbent who is seeking re-election. We have approximately 2.5 weeks to go. Jason, you were seeking consensus, which always, of course, puts me on edge.
I'm a uniter, not a divider.
Well, I understand that, and that's a recent change for you. And of course, you do that when you start quoting Democrats, which always makes me a little suspicious.
Well,
I think you wanted to raise the patent
Sure.
issue.
You're a businessman, you're a publisher. If I were to decide to say, take Minnesota Law and Politics.
Oh my gosh.
Great magazine. by the way.
Well, who's on the cover?
I
of
have
that?
no idea. But if I were to decide to take that magazine and just make reprints and distribute them across the country, across the world, using your intellectual property to make a profit, because it's very cheap to make a generic L&P. I don't have to hire reporters.
Sure.
You'd be upset over that, rightly so, right?
I would.
You would, because you have an intellectual right, a property right there. Do drug companies then have a patent right to the new drugs they develop, spending $500 million to get a new drug to the market.
Or more.
Or more. When they develop that, 12 years it takes to get approved, and then should another country, say Canada, say a country in Africa, be able to simply copy that recipe and distribute that drug, which doesn't cost as much money.
No, and that's where some of the problems fall in, because Canada says if you don't sell it to us for this price, we'll consider that your patent to be inactive. And if you have an inactive patent, then we can duplicate it. So they're facing some real problems. So we have to look at worldwide kind of patent respect and how our trade laws are going to be handled. That's going to be the crux of helping to bring down these costs, and not just coming to, say, the pharmaceuticals or any other industry and say, we're going to start putting price controls on you, and we're going to take the profit out of your business. And with that profit also goes research and development, and the new drugs won't be there. I'll just tell you, I talked to 3M a couple of weeks ago, and they told me that
I bet you did.
about 30% of their profit, well, this was a business meeting, nothing else.
All right.
But 30% of their profits come today from products they developed within the last 4 years. So just think of all the new drugs that are on the market today from research and development, and if we cut that off, that new miracle drug for curing diabetes or cancer or anything else in the future will not be there.
But that's why the prices are higher in America, because this is one of the last few places where the patents are honored.
That's right.
Where the rule of law is still honored, and that's a problem that Congress needs to address.
Well, and if we're going to reach some form of consensus here, I assume, and Canada would have a hard time declaring our patents inactive because under the WTO restrictions, which is one of the reasons I assume you supported China's entry into the WTO, is that they claim at least that they will be bound by those intellectual.
But that still has to be worked out, and I think the Madrid conference was one of the first steps that were to be working that out. But today, that is not true.
Right. Gil Gutnick and other Republicans have suggested that people be allowed to buy drugs anywhere in the world and re-import them into this country without FDA concerns and without being stopped by any kind of tariff restrictions or supposed health restrictions. And that would then allow seniors to buy drugs more cheaply, for example, from Canada. Do you support that?
I have voted for that as well, but we had the concerns on there. They have to be FDA approved to bring them back in.
All right.
And but again, that's not going to solve all the problems.
But why couldn't Medicare do that?
Well, that's some of the things that we're going to have to discuss and put on the table, and that's
wouldn't that be price controls?
That's got to be part of reforms, and it's not to set price controls on it, and that's basically what Medicare does today. Medicare tells a provider or a doctor or a hospital, we're going to pay you this amount of money, no matter what it costs you to do your job or to provide the service. We're only going to pay you this amount, and that comes in rationing. It allows or disallows choice, and I think it's also going to put a real crimp in service and the quality of health care. And if we get led down the path of what is Mark Dayton calling universal health care, which is basically government mandated
Well,
care.
he hasn't said that. He said there was mandate that employers should be mandated.
And then they asked him about it this last week.
But that wasn't universal, and that's not single payer, Senator.
Yeah, but he backed away from it. Now he says, well, maybe we can exempt employers under 25 employees. Well, 83% of the 43 million that are uninsured are employed by people who are employers who have 25 or less employees. So basically, his plan does nothing.
Senator, that's why Jerry Januzaj opposed that. That's why Mike Cerisi opposed that in the previous primary. Kill small business.
Well, it may be an honest argument to say that if you exempt those under 25, that portion of the employed populace is not covered.
And that's about 43 million, and that's exactly the problem we have.
Well, you can argue about the numbers. I've seen much smaller numbers, but that's not the same thing as saying that Mark Dayton supports a universal payer system.
I could go through this, but universal, he says, all right, universal coverage, and it's going to be mandated. Now, who's going to oversee the mandates? What are the mandates going to be, and who's going to make sure those mandates are followed, and on which employers,
Senator, we do that in the insurance area all the time. Every state does it.
Not the same way. And this is the way Clinton Gore began their plan in 1993. And, of course, you know, they ended up with regional health care
that
facilities.
was rejected. That was rejected.
Well, let's talk about that with regard to prescription drugs.
Well.
Under the prescription drug coverage, and you're right, Dayton hasn't been clear on this, but presumably he supports prescription drug coverage the way the bills are working themselves through the Congress. Would there be health care financing administration regional pools of how much money is budgeted for this region for prescription drugs?
Right, and he has proposed that.
So if there's HCFA regional budgets and the Minnesota Midwest region is spending more than the budget allows, what would be the federal government's response to those prescription drugs? No more drugs for that area?
The same thing that Clinton Gore did under the administration for outpatient cancer treatment, and how they wanted to reduce some of the costs, they said, we're not going to provide this anymore. So who had the choice when the government said, no, we're not going to provide this treatment? That could happen the
Senator,
same way.
I'm going to change topics.
And by the way, numbers of states who have tried these cooperatives, they've all failed, or the majority of them have failed to the point where they're discontinuing. So Mark is
Don't tell that to the
echoing
people in Oregon, but
well, Mark Dayton is echoing plans that have not worked, and it poses new restrictions and limits on people. And that's
Senator,
not
I want to move on to some other issues, although again, I think that Dayton would point out that we're talking about requiring employers above a certain employment level.
He never said that before. Now he's backtracking. So Dayton is backing away from Dayton on his plans, and every time he gets called on it, he has to reinvent himself in order to, maybe his focus groups are telling him what to say.
When you first ran and were elected in 1994, you gave an interview to the Minneapolis paper, and you were asked what your 3 most cherished issues were, and you gave this answer. Term limits for members of Congress, that hasn't happened. A constitutional amendment.
Give me one more term and it will.
Okay. So the first 6 years that didn't happen, but will in the next 6 years?
No, I've never said, I said that I agreed to 6 terms in the House, but 2 terms in the Senate.
Well,
I thought it's good term limits.
All right. So we got one more 6-year period before that happens.
Right.
All right.
And I do this as a job, not as a hobby.
All right. A constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget. You voted for that. That hasn't come back on the floor of the Senate for 2 years.
Well, we've still pushed it, but we need a balanced budget. I voted for it when it was there, and I would like to have it because I think the government needs to be responsible.
And that failed with a Republican majority. And then the
By
elimination.
one vote after, but yes, it failed because we couldn't get the 67. We got 66. That was close.
An elimination of unfunded mandates. What unfunded mandates have you eliminated?
Well, there's been a number of them, but we could do more. And if I'm disappointed at one thing that Congress has not been able to do, and that is taking a lot of these mandates by government and going through them, reanalyzing them. Exactly what is the EPA's mandate? What is the mandate for the Forest Service? What are our Park Services supposed to do? And when you talk about mandates, we still have mandates dealing with education, and we still have mandates dealing with other things. There, the government needs to fund those, and I've strongly supported, for special ed and Head Start and IDEA to make sure the government lives up to its 40% mandate. Before we begin any other new programs, let's live up and pay the ones we have.
The greatest unfunded mandate in many respects was the old welfare system, which the Republican Congress turned into some sort of form of block grants to the states and actually reformed welfare. Those were huge mandates in the old command and control style welfare.
But enough of the Clinton accomplishments.
After 3 times he finally signed welfare.
It was a Republican plan, and he finally signed it. He takes credit for
well, and the DLC was founded for that purpose. But
Yeah.
Senator, one other thing that disturbs a lot of us, I think, is some of the tone of the campaign. You're not the only one, but I notice a lot of ads being run in this state by the Chamber of Commerce on your behalf. What business does the Chamber of Commerce have running ads on your behalf in this state?
Well, they have every right for free speech and to be able to
Certainly
run.
have that right. I'm asking why they're doing it.
Well, I would assume that they support some of the positions I've taken in Congress and some of the votes that I've taken, and they have every right then to support me for re-election.
Well, I
why
agree
does
they
the
have a First
Sierra
Amendment
Club
right.
support Mark Dayton?
And
why are they going to run ads or have run ads on his behalf?
The
It's the same question.
AFL-CIO.
I haven't seen those ads.
96.
By
They
Well, in terms of your campaign, but one of the things that bothers me about those Chamber of Commerce paid for ads on your behalf, particularly the one entitled "Crazy," is the phrase when it refers to Mark Dayton about he must have taken one weird bus trip. Senator, is that an effort to suggest that Mark Dayton has a drug problem, or that he has some kind of prescription problem, or that he's weird, or that he took bad trips at some earlier time?
No.
What's that phrase mean to you? Weird bus trip.
It didn't mean any of the
What did it mean to
things
you?
that you meant. To me, it just meant it was an out-of-step way of trying to address a problem that's there, and by taking
What problem?
taking bus trips to Canada, that's for political show. He has done nothing but politicize this issue. He has done nothing to provide any concrete plan or idea that's going to help provide prescription drugs for our senior citizens. I have. 2 years ago, I worked on this. I have it out there in concrete saying that we're going to help those who need the help. But Mark Dayton decides to use this as a political issue. He politicizes it. He goes to focus groups to tell them exactly what to say, how to say. And I said, this is a little bit weird to be taking people up to Canada and bringing them back as an answer to a very, very complicated and tough question. Other than that, I read nothing into that.
There was a lot of concern when a local Republican decided to say, if you don't switch the Speaker of the House here in the state legislature, I'm going to dry up the contributions. At least I'm not going to contribute anymore. And people were talking, I think John Marty said, oh, that amounts to bribery and this and that. If you really want to talk something coming close to bribery, it's literally giving something to voters, taking them up to Canada and back on the assumption you're going to get their vote.
That's right.
Now,
It always makes me feel good when you quote John Marty with approval. It's really kind of a revelation.
just trying to apply the same standards
Ah.
to Republicans as are applied to Democrats.
But not only buying him with those type of votes, but Mark Dayton is out there trying to bribe people with their own money from the general fund, telling them he's going to give them everything and give it to them for nothing.
Hold
and
that
that's
thought.
bribing with
Senator
their own
Grams,
money.
Vance and I will be back right after this to wrap things up with incumbent United States Senator Rod Grams.
We'd like